This is 90s and Noughties UK, a podcast on UK pop culture of the 90s and 2000s. If you want to contact the show, email 90sandnaughties@gmail.com, tweet us on @90sandnaughtiesuk on Twitter, or check us out on Facebook, 90s and Noughties UK.
.4 Children. Did you watch it back in the day? If the answer is yes, then you might just enjoy this. I'm joined in this episode by J.D Collins from Don't Slam Your Podcast, a 2.4 Children podcast. And I'm so glad I got the name right because, I wasn't sure when I spoke to him the other day. J.D Collins from the 2.4 Children podcast. It's called Don't Slam Your Podcast. I feel something along those lines. How are you doing? It's a great podcast. I have heard it. This isn't the first time I'm hearing of it.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. Oh, no, but yeah, thank you so much. I've been listening to yours as well. I particularly enjoyed your episodes, recent ones on As Time Goes By and Goodnight Sweetheart as well. So just great to be bringing these brilliant comedies together, because I think those two are, like 2.4 Children, quite underrated, but also classics of the decade and of all time as well.
Yeah, I mean, regular listeners to your podcast will probably know, because I know how these things work. How did you find 2.4 Children?
Oh, it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try and condense it as much as I can. It's about a 20-year story. So I grew up, I was born in 1995. I was sort of, you kind of become aware of the world when you're about 4 or 5 years old. And we had Sky at home, and so I was obsessed with Gold, or UK Gold as it was known as then. And the shows that I remember vividly were Only Fools and Horses, Keeping Up Appearances, The Vicar of Dibley, Mr. Bean, and 2.4 Children. And, all these shows were still quite recent in that time. And I didn't know what I particularly enjoyed about 2.4. I just enjoyed watching it. I think as a kid, things draw you in. Even though I didn't understand what was going on, I might enjoy the visual humor. Then it was sort of shown a bit over the years, and I'd catch up on it. When I was 16 and 17, they showed 2.4 in full again on Gold, because for a few years in the late 2000s, they only showed the first 4 series because of issues with copyright of the music. And that's a theme that runs throughout the history of 2.4, unfortunately. What I really drew me in on the sort of teenage watch of it was the surreal humor and the darkness and the parodies and the pathos. And I realized that was the kind of humor I was drawn to. And at the same time, I discovered shows like 30 Rock, One Foot in the Grave, Spaced, and 2.4 really kind of infiltrated that interest. And then it went off at Gold a few years later. And then when I was 24, it came back. And I just rewatched it again, and it was like a completely different show. I was drawn more to the realism of it and the observations about everyday life. And even though I was 24 then, don't have children, I still don't have children, I could recognize the sort of mirroring of real life, which I feel like even more so now. And it's just a show that's kind of always come back in my life at various times. And it's like rewatching it for the first time. And, I just think it's so underrated and deserves so much more discussion. And that's one of the reasons why I started the podcast.
And that's why it's so good that it's appeared on BritBox. There's a couple of episodes missing, but, we'll probably get to that. They're on BBC iPlayer as well, so they're more accessible than they've ever been. I remember when they were on Gold, and I think they used to just broadcast, say, the first couple of series. And what you find watching those is it hasn't quite found its surrealist edge. And I do wonder whether when people remember it, they're remembering a mixture of different things. Maybe they don't associate that surreal bit and they just think it's like this cozy family sitcom. One Foot in the Grave kind of has the same thing, where it's like you remember the cozy elements of it, but that surrealist part does take a little while.
It does, and I don't think what helped in the 2000s when it was only the first 4 series is that they only released the first 3 on DVD. And you're absolutely right; it really kind of picks up more and more in the sort of 4th to 5th series. And I think what was interesting, I know I've spoken to people even before I did the podcast who would have been in their childhood years or even teen years during the 90s will have remembered 2.4. And the common response I got from people was, I watched it, but I don't remember much about it. And I think the big thing for me was on the 3rd sort of big rewatch of it in 2019, I started to see what Twitter or people on Twitter were saying about it. And the phrase I kept coming across was, this is weirder than I remember. It's better than I remember. It holds up very well. And the phrase was, it deserves a reassessment. And then a couple of years ago, do you remember BBC Store?
Yes.
That was like, it was almost an online digital iPlayer which you could buy things off, and it didn't last long. But I remember in 2015, British Comedy Guide put a post out saying of all the shows that they wanted on there that may have not been on DVD or repeated much. There'd been things like Sykes, and that was the week that was, and 2.4 was on there. And the thing they said was, today it's considered a bland middle class run of the mills comedy, family comedy, and it wasn't, packed with dark surreal themes. This I don't know what a common with the phrase, but it was very much getting across how it was nothing like the sort of, not like My Family, which I think, to be honest, I don't think helped as well coming so soon after 2.4. I mean, I've said this before. The dad, played by Gary Elson, sadly passed away in 2000, only about 9 months after they made the last series. And then almost a week to the day after he died, BBC One started My Family. And I think it was because of a new century, a new comedy. It was almost like a new beginning. But I think people had a perception of 2.4, especially critics, who thought, oh, it's just this bland comedy. And then when another comedy came, I mean, I don't mind My Family. It has its moments. And I think the acting slightly makes it better. The actors in it make it more watchable. But, I think it almost gave validation to these critics of 2.4, a viewpoint of 2.4 children that was never there. That wasn't actually what it was, but for them it felt like, oh, well, this show was just like 2.4 children, but it really wasn't.
But then at times,
give a long-winded response.
That's fine. At times the 90s felt a bit like a black hole of comedy, because there's a list of comedies I think that would have been massive at the time they were broadcast, and then in the decades that followed just disappeared off the radar for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think 2.4 for me, I think is a combination of factors for that. I think, the My Family thing, the copyright made it a big problem because they used a lot of music and songs that, when it came to years later, getting copyright and royalties made it impossible. The other one was the Fab One model. That was a big problem eventually. But it's a shame because, again, when I was watching in 2019, there was it was on at the same time as there were 2 new comedies on BBC One. There was a new version Alan Partridge series, and there was Warren, which was Martin Clunes. He was this driving instructor. And I just remember watching them and thinking, tomorrow and later I'm going to be watching a sitcom from nearly 30 years ago that's aged so much better, is better written, better produced, and just so much better put together. And I agree with what you say about the 90s. I mean, even something like, I don't think it's necessarily forgotten about, but probably like the British Empire, which I know you've just started, and I've started a podcast on. I think that show's probably had more resonance than 2.4 because it had the full DVDs and it was slightly repeatable on gold. But that too seems to not be as heralded as the classic as I think it deserves to be, because these shows were so well written. They had they drew on a humanity and a real life quality that in the 2000s the comedies just went a bit more. I don't like to sound snobby because I don't like snobby sort of discussion, but it became, I think, a little bit more basic, a bit more archetypal. The characters, a bit more cliched. Whereas, as I say, I think the sitcom of the 90s really got to realism, even when they were sitcoms that could go into the ridiculous or slapstick, you know?
Yeah. I have literally only just, as you point out there, started watching the Britas Empire. And at first, I thought, what am I watching? Because it seemed very cardboardy at the beginning. And I found the lead very unlikable. And obviously, there's a bit of a thing now, I think, with some of the things that this character would bring up. And actually, they're laughing at him, but they're also sympathizing with him because he's just trying to help most of the time, you know. And I think what I came to, I mean, I'm on episode 6 now, within a day, and that surely says something. And I think he's up there with people like Victor, where it's like people just misunderstand him. You know, he's just trying to get on. He's trying to do his best, and actually, it ain't working out because you know the it just doesn't work.
Absolutely. And I think something you say there, words you mentioned there, I think is a good example of what ends up happening, possibly with all TV shows, but especially comedy, I notice, is the misunderstanding or misremembering of things. Like you say, Victor Meldrew isn't a grumpy old moaning old man. He actually speaks up for everybody. And he's commenting on things that are worth complaining about. As you'll get to know Mr. Britus, he's a lot more sympathetic. You understand, especially in the second series, which I've just finished recording with my co-host Chris, who was in the 2.4 podcast. You know, you learn a bit more about his background of why he is that way, and it's very well observed. And I think with 2.4 Children as well, you know, yes, you had the surreal elements. It was very visual. Obviously, you had things like the Christmas specials would always end with a musical number, or even sometimes normal series episodes would have musical numbers in as well. But the way that the characters are developed and they're so well drawn, beyond the usual what you would expect with a family sitcom. So in most family sitcoms, it would be that the dad's a bit grumpy, the mum's a bit sort of what's the word, tactless, a bit head in the clouds, you know, really wholesome, and then the kids would just be brattish or they'd have arguments with their parents all the time. 2.4 is slightly similar but very different in the way it plays out, and the setup's different. So Bill is Belinda Lang. She's the mum of the Porter family. She is, you know, very downtrodden. She's always picking up after everyone and everyone takes advantage of her, but she wants to begin a catering business with her best friend and neighbor Rona, who's like the Porter's surrogate auntie and sister. And you know, she's a woman who actually strives for what she wants and is very determined, and that plays out very realistically. You have Ben, played by Gary Olson, who is the 0.4 of the family. He is a big kid, which I think men are more like that than would like to admit. And what's clever about the show is, you know, Andrew Marshall, who wrote it, who I will sing his praises forever, because he just created a series which was such a believable family dynamic. They had a believable house, and obviously that comes down to the set designers. And the way that they live their lives just feels so real. Bill goes to get shopping. She has to go and pick something up. She's driving somewhere. The car breaks down or something. She's, you know, they're a working family. They're always, you know, they do okay, but then they can struggle with money. And, you know, these are elements that people often forget. They just think it's all knockabout. And I think in particular show, I say he wrote for women especially well. I mean, today we talk a lot about how certain social groups are portrayed and represented, especially women in comedy. And I you know, hear all the arguments. I'm thinking, Andrew Marshall was doing that 30 years ago alongside Birds of a Feather, Ab Fab, Vicar Dibley came appearances. You know, there was a really good era of comedy where you had great female characters who were real, funny, flawed, and relatable.
Yeah, I'm in agreement there, because you don't always associate 2.4 Children alongside those, but now that you mention it, certainly it's the strong female characters. I think Bill, occasionally she kind of runs the whole show, doesn't she?
Oh yeah, completely. The funny thing about Bill is that she has to keep everyone together, and often in trying to stop everyone falling into a disaster, she puts herself in in the line of fire. And I think that's what makes her so believable, really. And I say it's well cast. And I think what really pushed me to do the podcast, and actually the book that I'm currently writing about the show. So the podcast was more the critical guide. We review every episode. And then the book is going to be about the making of the series. So anyone who likes the Richard Webber One Foot in the Grave book, that's the style I'm going for. And I always wanted a book on 2.4, and I wanted more people to talk about it. So I thought, well, no one's doing it. I'm going to do it myself. Because I think when I was watching in 2019, I was just thinking, this is nearly 20 years since it finished, nearly 30 since it began. We're nearly 32 years since it began, which is scary. There's just something had to happen, whether it was to go on Netflix, because the BritBox and I wasn't on then. iPlayer, I don't think we're doing box sets at that point. DVDs isn't going to happen. I think that's a definite not going to happen. And I just thought this could be the only series in existence that could just vanish forever. And it doesn't deserve, I don't think any show deserves it. Even the worst shows don't deserve it. No one, sets out to make a bad show. But 2.4 ran for 8 series for a reason. Not every show in the 90s, even with 4 channels, ran for many years. It was a very well-written show, very well acted, very well produced, hit a chord with the audience. And I'm just so happy that this podcast began at a time when, BritBox was always going to happen, I think, because if they could get the rights, BritBox put everything out there. iPlayer was the surprise, because although a lot of us fans think of it as comedy gold, they were putting out stuff that was the obvious classics. They were putting out Keeping Up Appearances. They put out, I think, Blackadder at one point as well. 2.4, in our view, would always be up there. But the fact that someone clearly suggested it, worked hard to sort out the copywriting however they have, and it was on for a year, and it's up as being available for over a year. So I'm just so thrilled.
And it means that people keep discovering it. My next question is a bit of a hard one, because as a fan, I'm sure you would have wanted to see more. We don't like it when our favourite show ends. But do you think they could have... Are you familiar with 8 Simple Rules?
I love 8 Simple Rules. I watched that when it was on originally.
So basically, John Ritter, the lead, died, and they just carried on. They brought in a couple of new characters, and they carried on. Do you think that 2.4 Children could have done that?
Well, it's funny you mentioned John Ritter. He died 20 years ago in a couple of months. I read somewhere the other day, and that's frightening, because I remember that very, very well. And that was another good family sitcom, actually, from America. Well, I know that they were going to do another series just because I think the show was so popular that 2.4, they were going to carry it on. I think the problem, I think where 8 Simple Rules got away with it and 2.4 I don't think could have, was that 8 Simple Rules had only done a series, 1 season. So we got to know the character, yes, and we established it. And I think his loss was as a character. So when they wrote it into the series, it was a big loss for the audience. But that had only been established in a year. 2.4 would have had 8 years to basically say, this family you've known, now it's kind of, we're going to bring it back, even though Gary's gone. I think it's sad enough how it all played out, in the fact, there's no hints of what's of the final series that anything, like that would happen. So I think I think it probably was right for it to end when it did because of that. Had Gary not died, I think it could have easily had a couple more years in 2001 to finish. But yeah, I'm glad it didn't carry on without Gary, to be honest.
I mean, it ended almost perfectly because it was the Millennium episode.
Oh gosh, the final episode is frightening how kind of it rounds it off well. I mean, I won't give anything away for people who haven't seen it, but as you say, for a sitcom that so defined the 90s, it ends on Millennium Night. Almost all the characters are there. And if you hear the last line, which is Bill Porter, Belinda Lang's character, who's the main star of the show, it's a goodbye. And it's done in an unsentimental, not knowing. I think what made it work is it wasn't written as the finale, but it works well because of the elements. And yeah, I think it ended perfectly without knowing it was ending and without knowing what was to come.
Definitely. Have you come to? It's been a while since I listened to the 2.4 Children podcast. Have you come to an end with it, or are you still carrying on?
The episode reviews are finished now. I have plans to do more. My most recent episodes were about we did a quiz for Christmas, and recently I did a episode where we explored the film and TV parodies. A lot of parodies of film and TV and 2.4 children types you wouldn't see, wouldn't seem out of place in The Simpsons, or some of The Simpsons have even done as well, like The Prisoner. I would like to. I'm planning to do more. My main priority, I think, on 2.4 children front is the book. I've done all this, all 8 series now, and the book I announced last August and kind of hoped it would be quicker than it has been. I've interviewed all the cast I'm going to interview. I won't say who, but I think people will be very happy with who's involved. A few crew members, and those processes aren't always necessarily quick. These people very kindly take time out of their own time to talk to a fan who wants to do a book, and then putting it all together, which I am now. I'm trying to work on an episode a day at the moment to get a really kind of a decent draft of it done. But I think I will go back to the podcast. I think I want to do some more themed episodes, maybe and more quizzes. But I think it's just going to be more intermittent now, because I think the main part of it is done. But the book, I think, is the priority.
Well, I look forward to reading it, and I know that as a fan of many TV shows, some of which are very underrated, it's always great when there's at least one fan out there who not only feels the same as you do, but wants to devote an entire book to it. So I do applaud you for that.
Thank you. And I'd like to give a shout out to someone actually who has been very, very good at keeping the 2.4 children name alive. And that is a man called David Carman. David started a Facebook page in 2009, which was dedicated to getting 2.4 children on DVD. It's a campaign page. But in that time, he built up a fan base, an online following, and it got all 2.4 fans together. And he's been a guest on my podcast a few times. I've helped with the Facebook page a few times. So and what's been nice about the podcast is that as soon as I announced it, people were so looking forward to it, and they've been so kind and had consistent viewers and listeners, should I say. And yeah, it's been nice to meet lots of fans, and it's really enriched my life, especially after these last difficult few years. It's just been wonderful, and yeah, it just shows that there are people who have the same interests as you out there.
I mean, as a fan of that show, how do you feel about, having spoken to people involved with this thing and, people who wrote it, worked on it? How does that make you feel as a longtime fan?
What's been so lovely is, I know there's the saying, don't meet your heroes. But I'm so glad I met all the people I've met who are associated with the show. Andrew Marshall, who wrote it, is one of my comedy writing heroes. I think he's an absolutely underrated genius. And what was so nice when I put out the Twitter page before I recorded, I was recording the first season before I put them out, and he got in touch and he offered to give memories. And so I knew I wanted him involved, but to do that was just so kind. And then I've interviewed him for the book as well, and everyone's just been so kind and generous with their time, and it's I've been very starstruck, but mainly just very moved actually, that these people I've watched on TV for 20 years of my life, almost my whole life, and my parents watched 2.4 in the 90s, so I think probably quite strange, something that they watched in the 90s. And then their son, who was only just born in that middle of that decade, then 25 years later, does this podcast, which no one knew what podcast does then, to talk to the cast and crew. It's just been, I don't know what my younger life would say. I think it's just been a really amazing journey, and just a nice passion project that's worked out. That's what I'm grateful for. And I'm grateful that everyone who's been involved with it has they've all got happy memories of the show. So it was just nice to be able to put that together.
So if there's anybody listening who has never seen this show, is there an episode that you would recommend to them to view?
I would say as a nice middle ground, as a kind of, if I had to put it as like the greatest hits of 2.4, what makes it really work, it's the fourth series, episode 5, called Frenzy. And I'd say if you want an episode that explores the normality of the family life, the slightly out there surreal element, and the quirky extravaganza with a parody, but with the humanity going throughout, I would say Frenzy, episode 5 of the fourth series.
This is one of those shows, I think, that you could talk about at length, I think, because there's just so much. It's been a little while since I watched it, which is why I'm slightly vague on a few things. But I think that is that because in some ways certain elements of 2.4 Children are forgettable, or is it just, I don't know. What do you think?
I think the thing that I get comes back to what I said before about people I've spoken to who watched it in the 90s and as teenage kids. It probably went over their heads, the surreal stuff. Whereas, and I think probably the same with One Foot in the Grave as well. I mean, I would say Victor Meldrew and the catchphrase, "I don't believe it," is probably what people associate that show with mostly. I think that with 2.4 Children, most probably like I did when I was a younger kid, just had it on in the background and didn't really take it in. You know what I mean? I think it is a show that, as I say, a lot of people have gone back to, seen more in it, appreciate it for what it was. And in a weird way, perhaps now is the time for it to have its kind of reassessment and people to see it for as it was. But it was celebrating and people did enjoy it. I think it just seems to have taken a while for that the afterlife appreciation to happen. I think another thing as well is I think that in a way we're going back to these 90s shows. You had like One Foot in the Grave, British Empire, and Good Night Sweetheart. These kind of shows with these sort of quirky elements and irreverent humor. For me personally, these shows seem fresher now than they were when I was watching them 10 years ago, because I think in the last 20 years of New Millennium, comedy's gone in a really weird direction in some ways. I mean, I'm glad things like The Royal Family started just so we could, there was the option to have single camera, non-studio audience shows. But I think what's happened is studio-based comedies have become a lot more, as I do say, I think they're more gag-driven. I think they're more one-dimensional with characters. And so I think these 90s shows, and 2.4 especially, because that's a family-based comedy. Yes, we've had something like Outnumbered, which I would say is probably the successor of 2.4 to an extent, more so than My Family. But in My Family, you had things like, I think Not Going Out is become more of a family show now, family space sitcom. These shows are well written, well produced. They bring their audience, and I'm not knocking them for that. But I definitely think that they lack the singular vision and the kind of innovation and believability of these 90s shows. And I think maybe because we've had a lull period and people are missing good comedy, they're going back to the old stuff, seeing them with fresh eyes and realizing, oh gosh, we wish we had something like that now.
Do you think maybe that's because in the 90s there was a lot of pushing the envelope, a lot of pushing it to see as far as you could go, which kind of started in the 80s with things like The Young Ones, then into the early 90s with things like Bottom, and it just got more and more kind of bawdy in a way. And it
100%.
And it meant that they could push it. That alternative comedy movement, I think, did a lot. And of course, as you mentioned, One Foot in the Grave was kind of one of the first ones where it was almost, how did I describe it to somebody yesterday when they asked about British comedy and they hadn't seen some of these things? And I said, well, One Foot in the Grave, for example, is one of those things that looks like a cozy sitcom, and then something weird happens and you realize there's more to it. And that is the alternative comedy coming in. You know, it's alternative comedy disguised as cozy comedy.
100%. And the fact is, when you think of the alternative scene, most of those shows in the 80s, like the young ones, started off on BBC Two, and Bottom was on BBC Two as well. But these 90s shows were like One Foot in the Grave and 2.4 British Empire. These were primetime BBC One sitcoms. I think One Foot was on at the post-watershed, but the other shows were pre-watershed, 8:30 weeknight shows for families. And they were, that's another thing I'd say, with Andrew Marshall, he wrote something for everyone. It goes back to what I say. I watched this show at different ages and got something out of it each time. He was not in any way talking down to the audience. And when you read the book, you'll understand some things, the ideas he had with some of the storylines, really interesting thoughts. And I think, what I would say about One from the Grave, I sort of see it as Terry and June meets the Grim Reaper. And then 2.4 is a bit like Bless This House, not in front of the children. So if you put Bless This House plus Not in Front of the Children, times by Butterflies, and then times by, say, I don't know, there's no real other series I can think of from before then that was like it, but times by a sort of weird element that was a bit out there and darker, you have 2.4 children, and yet people just think, oh, it's just Not in Front of the Children, which it wasn't.
One thing we should mention before I let you go is the music, the intro music. Does that contribute in some ways to the misunderstanding about what that show actually is? Because it's very Good Life.
I agree. Yes, it is. So the music was composed by Howard Goodall, who does a lot of classical music, but he's particularly known for comedy. He did the music for, to name but a few, Red Dwarf, Mr. Bean, Thin Blue Line, The Vicar of Dibley, Catherine Tate Show, and a couple of others, and Blackadder. Yeah, it is quite chirpy. The music I use for the podcast is from the beginning of the final episode of the second series, which is a more kind of quieter version of the song on a piano, which, if you see the episode, you understand it fits the tone, and it's a little bit more melancholy. I think, in a weird way, if it had been more out there and a little bit weirder, it might have almost done the opposite effect in a way. Yes, it would have been more in tone with the show and people might have got it more, but it might have seemed a bit more out of place. But I think the whole point of 2.4 Children is that it is meant to look like a family comedy. And I think the downside of that is people misinterpret it without properly watching it. But at the same time, it sort of lulls people into this false sense of security, false sense of a cozy world. And then actually, it being an Andrew Marshall world, it throws a curveball at you.
Yeah, definitely so. In terms of the other music in the show, you mentioned that there is always a musical number at some points in the series, decades before Mrs. Brown's Boys does it. And that really surprised me when I rewatched it, because I feel like there's a Christmas episode where it's very tense, and then at the end they just come out with this Christmas medley that has nothing to do with the episode, and you can't help thinking, was that filler? But I really don't think it was.
No, in the Christmas special, I think the idea in the first one is that, the first Christmas special is about the sort of obligatory aspect of Christmas, which I think everyone can relate to even today. And the idea is, the characters are stuck in the house they don't want to be in, and wanting to do something different, and then it's sort of a comment on how the audience might feel, and then the song at the end is just to give them a bit of relief and bring that Christmassy feel. I think that what you realize when you watch 2.4 and when you learn more about Andrew Marshall's influences, his influences are all across that show. It has a kind of old Hollywood musical feel to it. And you mentioned a really good point there about Mrs. Brown's Boys. The other aspect of 2.4 Children is very occasionally, it didn't happen often, but very occasionally, they would break the fourth wall, or it would go meta, to use a modern expression. But what I always love about those elements in the musical numbers is, unlike Mrs. Brown's Boys, which I will say I liked in the first couple of series, I did think it was a grower, and I think it was very, at its best, really good fun. But it became house style very quickly. The musical numbers, it became an ingredient of every episode. Whereas with 2.4 children, you didn't always expect it. As I say, Christmas wise, everyone knew they would have a song at the end, but then sometimes a musical number would happen mid-series randomly when no one expected it. The episode I mentioned, Frenzy, is a good example of that, but it's done in a very, it's very important to the integral to the plot. And so, with 2.4, I think it was, you never knew from episode to episode what you were expecting. And I think it's one of those shows that it does warrant multiple watches, because you watch episodes and then you notice something and then you'll notice something different the other time. They're so dense, those stories and production. I just think it's marvelous.
Yes, I need to have a second rewatch very soon. I saw it 20 odd years ago, but like you, I had no memory of it. And then as I watched through it, I was like, I remember this.
Yes.
You certain moments. You always remember the dad, but everything else I think was just was lost on me. So it was great to revisit it, and it is available on BritBox, but there are a couple of episodes missing. Do you know the reason for that?
And copyright. So over the years, as I say, at one point in the late 2000s, only the first 4 series were shown. Then when it came back on Gold in 2011, when I watched it, there was the same 4 series. And then I remember, I don't know why I remember this, but in August 2012, they then put all of them 5 to 8 on. And then every repeat season since, they've had all 8 series and some of the Christmas specials. However, there have been episodes which one load of blot of Gold repeats don't have. The Relaxez-Vous, the 94 Christmas special, hasn't been on the Gold repeats. So the episodes missing in series 7 are the second episode on BritBox. So the 7th series episode, When Saturday Comes, and Malcolm X. When Saturday Comes is a classic episode. It's a brilliant episode. And Malcolm X, I think, is well written, but I think, When Saturday Comes is a real loss that's not on BritBox. So if people can get a license fee or a chance to watch 2.4, I'd watch it all on iPlayer, because it's also as uncut as you're going to get with the whole thing.
Well, like I say, go and check it out on BBC iPlayer. When is your book due to be released?
I'm not 100% sure. I think it needs fully writing. It's going to be just getting the approvals and checking out and stuff, and then depending on if I can get a publisher or if I have to self-publish it myself. It's definitely not going to be in the next year, and for sure. But I will still be doing podcasts, and I will keep people up to date. I may even release a few interviews with certain cast members, so you get a flavor of what's going to come in the book. So it's being written. It's definitely being written, and I'm very excited to release it, but I just don't know when yet.
Well, in preparation for that, people can check out your podcast. I will leave all of the details of how to listen to that in the description below. Thank you, JD, for coming on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you, Jamie. It's been lovely to be on, and I really enjoyed your podcast. So great achievement. Well done. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to 90s and Noughties UK, a podcast on UK pop culture of the 90s and 2000s. Please remember to rate, comment and subscribe on your favourite podcast provider. If you want to contact the show, email 90sandnoughties@gmail.com, tweet us on @90sandnoughtiesuk on Twitter, or check us out on Facebook, 90s and Noughties UK. This is 90s and Noughties UK, a podcast on UK pop culture of the 90s and 2000s. If you want to contact the show, email 90sandnaughties@gmail.com, tweet us on @90sandnaughtiesuk on Twitter, or check us out on Facebook, 90s and Noughties UK.